The man who counted coppers every time he bought bread was now counting them for the last time in his life, and the seamstress watching him understood that whatever he was about to ask for mattered more than eating. Xander Cole had laid out 17 silver pennies, 4 half-pennies, and a collection of copper farthings so worn their stampings had rubbed smooth. Beside the coin sat a good wool coat with horn buttons, the kind a man kept for winter funerals and weddings, and a spare oar still pale with newness. The seamstress, Miriam Thatch, had been measuring hems and taking in waistbands for 30 years, and she knew desperation when it walked through her door carrying everything it owned. "I need a dress," Xander said. His voice had the flat calm of a man who had made his decision days ago and would not be argued with. Miriam set down her chalk. "For a woman." "I gathered that much. Is she coming for a fitting?" "No." Miriam waited. Xander Cole was known throughout the valley as a man who used words the way a miser used coins, spending only what he must and never a syllable more. He worked the river ferry at Shepherd's Crossing, had worked it since his father died 4 years back, and in all that time, Miriam had never heard him say more than was required to name a destination and collect a fare. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a length of thin cord, the kind used to tie apron strings. Along its length, 11 knots had been tied at irregular intervals. He laid it on the counter between them like an offering. "These are her measures," he said. Miriam picked up the cord, ran it through her fingers, felt the careful tightness of each knot. She had been a seamstress long enough to read a body in thread and tension. Shoulder to shoulder, shoulder to waist, waist to hip, around the bust, around the waist, around the hips, shoulder to floor. Neck to wrist, each measurement preserved in a knot that had been checked and rechecked until it sat exactly right. "How long did this take you?" she asked. "Since autumn." It was now the greening edge of spring, when the river ran high with snowmelt, and the first merchants of the year came down from the northern hills. 4 months, maybe 5. Long enough to memorize a woman through stolen glances and repaired aprons, through ferry crossings and careful attention that looked like nothing at all. "What color?" "Blue," he said. "The blue of deep water. Not sky, not robin's egg. Deep." Miriam had dye in her workroom that would answer that description. A good indigo she had been saving for a merchant's daughter who had never returned to claim it. She looked again at the cord, at the coins, at the coat and oar. She did not ask if he was certain. A man did not bring everything he owned for something he had not already decided. "It will take a week," she said. "I have linen that will work and the dye is good. The cut will be plain but well fitted, church quality." "Better than plain," Xander said. He pushed the coat forward. "Sell this. Use what it brings for better cloth, for whatever makes it right. And the oar, if you need it." Miriam had sons. She knew what a spare oar meant to a ferryman the way a sword meant everything to a soldier. It was the tool that kept you alive when the first oar broke, when the current was strong and one oar alone meant drowning or being swept into the rapids downstream. "Will she accept it?" Miriam asked. "A gift like this. She does not know it is coming," Xander said, "but she needs it. There is a court session in 9 days. The assize judge rides circuit from the capital, and she must testify about the Whitley Spring. She will be judged for how she looks as much as for what she says." Miriam understood then. Not a gift for a dance or a wedding, but armor. The kind of armor a woman needed when she walked into a room full of men who had already decided she was worthless. "She is not human," Miriam said. "Not a question." "No. Orc?" "Yes. Her name." Xander hesitated, and for the first time something moved behind the stone-flat calm of his expression. "Sera Penhallow." Miriam knew the name the way everyone in the valley knew it. The orc family camped on the poor side of the river, the side where the bank turned to marsh and the ground was too soft for farming. They had been there for years, longer than Xander had run the ferry, living in patched tents and a single badly built cottage that leaned north in the winter wind. The humans in Shepherd's Crossing tolerated them the way they tolerated crows in the corn, a nuisance, unwelcome but too much trouble to drive off completely. "People will talk," Miriam said. "They already talk." Miriam nodded. She took the cord and the coins and the coat, left the oar where it lay. "I will make her something worthy," she said. "Come back in 7 days." Xander left without another word. Miriam watched him go, then looked down at the cord in her hand. She untied the first knot, measured it against her tape, and began to sketch. Sera Penhallow had not expected kindness from the winter, but it had come anyway in the form of a silent ferryman, who asked no fare when her grandfather lay dying of fever and needed a physician on the far side of the river. That had been 2 years ago, deep in January, when the water ran sluggish and half frozen, and every crossing risked ice that could gut a boat from below. Her grandfather had been shaking so hard his teeth rattled, wrapped in every blanket they owned, and Sera had carried him through the snow to the ferry landing with her mother stumbling behind. The ferryman had been there, as he always was, standing beside his boat with his hands tucked into his coat and his breath steaming in the cold air. She had no money. She had said so immediately, before he could ask, because she would not beg and she would not owe a debt she could not pay. The ferryman had looked at her grandfather, at the fever-bright eyes and the gray cast to his skin, and then he had looked at her. "Get in," he said. She had tried to argue. He had ignored her, had simply taken her grandfather from her arms as though the old orc weighed nothing, and settled him into the boat with a gentleness that shocked her silent. Then he had handed her in, handed her mother in, and pushed off from the bank without another word. The crossing had been brutal. Ice scraped the hull, the current fought him at every stroke, and halfway across a chunk of frozen debris had slammed into the bow hard enough to crack the wood. He had not flinched, had only shifted his weight and pulled harder, and when they reached the far bank he had helped her carry her grandfather up the hill to the physician's house. He had left before she could thank him. She had turned to speak, and he was already gone, a dark shape walking back through the snow toward his boat. Her grandfather had lived. The physician had bled him and dosed him with willow bark and something bitter that smelled like rotted leaves, and after 3 days the fever had broken. When Sera returned to the crossing to go home, she had brought a coin her mother had borrowed from the physician's cook, had held it out with her hand shaking from more than cold. The ferryman had looked at the coin, then at her. "No," he said, "you are owed. You owe me nothing." "Then I am in your debt." He had shaken his head. "A man does not take fare for that. Get in." She had gotten in. She had not known what else to do. And on the way back across the river, with the water still running gray and dangerous and her mother weeping with relief beside her, she had watched the way his hands moved on the oars, steady and sure, and something had shifted in her chest like a key turning in a lock. She had been 17 then. She was 19 now, and in all that time she had crossed the river perhaps a dozen times, always with some excuse, some errand that took her to the market or the mill on the human side of the water. He never charged her full fare. She always tried to pay it. They had developed a routine as predictable as the seasons. She would hold out her coins, he would wave them away, she would insist. He would take half or sometimes nothing at all, and neither of them would say what they were actually trying to say. She did not know what he saw when he looked at her. She knew what she was, green-skinned, tusked, too broad in the shoulder and too strange in the face to be beautiful by any measure humans used. Her hair was black and coarse, Her hands were scarred from fieldwork and mending, and when she smiled, her tusks showed white against her lips. She was 19 years old, and she had never been courted, never been looked at with anything warmer than tolerance, and she had long since accepted that love was something that happened to other people in other lives. But she loved him anyway. Quietly, hopelessly, the way a woman might love the moon, distant and untouchable and entirely without expectation of return. She thought of this as she sat in her family's cottage, mending the same apron she had been mending for months. It was a losing battle. The fabric was old, the weave was weak, and every time she patched one hole another opened. But it was the only apron she owned, and she would need it when she went to the fields once the planting started, so she kept at it with thread that never quite matched and patience that was growing thin. Her mother came in from outside, shaking mud off her boots. "You are still working on that. It is not finished. It will never be finished. That apron is more patch than cloth." Sera tied off her thread and bit it clean. "Then I will wear patches." Her mother sighed and sat down beside the fire, holding her hands out to the warmth. She was older than she should be, worn down by years of cold and hunger, and the endless grinding effort of living somewhere no one wanted you. Her tusks were chipped, her hair had gone gray early, and her hands shook slightly in the evenings when the damp crept into her bones. "The assize is in 8 days, her mother said. "I know. You will have to speak, I know. They will not want to listen." Sera set the apron aside. "Then I will make them listen." Her mother looked at her with something that might have been pride or might have been grief. "Wear your good skirt," she said, "and braid your hair. Look as presentable as you can." Sera nodded. Her good skirt was brown wool, stained at the hem and patched at the knee. Her hair would braid neatly enough, but it would not change the shape of her face or the color of her skin. She would walk into that courtroom and every eye would see her as less than human, and no amount of neat braiding would change that. But she would go anyway, because the spring mattered. The Whitley spring fed the Penhallow fields, had fed them for as long as her family had camped on the riverbank. It was clean water in a place where clean water was scarce, and it meant the difference between vegetables that grew and vegetables that rotted in standing marsh. 3 months ago, the spring had slowed to a trickle. 2 months ago, it had stopped entirely. And when Sera had walked upstream to see why, she had found a new ditch cutting the spring away toward the Whitley estate, and a new wall built to keep her from reaching it. She had gone to the magistrate. The magistrate had told her to take it to the assize. The assize came twice a year, spring and autumn, and the judge heard disputes that were too large or too complicated for the local magistrate to settle. A stolen spring was exactly that kind of dispute, so she would go. She would stand in front of men in fine coats and polished boots, and she would tell them that her family's water had been stolen, and she would try not to flinch when they looked at her with contempt. She was not hopeful. But hope was a luxury, and she had never been able to afford luxuries. Xander returned to the seamstress's shop on the 7th day exactly, just after dawn when the streets were still quiet and the mist hung low over the river. Miriam was waiting for him with the dress laid out on her workbench, and when he saw it, something he had not known was clenched tight in his chest finally loosened. It was perfect. Not because it was fine, though it was finer than anything Sera had likely ever owned. Perfect because it was exactly what he had seen in his mind during all those months of watching her, measuring her, memorizing the way she moved through the world. The blue was deep and true, the color of the river at its deepest point where the current ran smooth and cold. The cut was simple but precise, fitted through the bodice and waist, loose enough in the skirts to move freely but tailored enough to look deliberate. The neckline was modest, the sleeves were long, and the whole thing was finished with a narrow band of white linen at the collar and cuffs that made the blue look even richer by contrast. "The coat sold for enough to buy good linen and a better weave," Miriam said. "I kept the dye simple because anything fancier would look like you were trying too hard. This looks like a woman who takes care of herself, like she has people who take care of her." Xander reached out and touched the fabric, felt the weight and quality of it. "It is right," he said. "I hope she thinks so." He folded the dress carefully, wrapped it in the length of plain cotton Miriam offered, and paid her the last of his coins. She did not offer to give any back. They both knew he had nothing left to bargain with. "How will you eat?" Miriam asked. "I will manage. Ferryman's wages are not much to begin with." "I know." Miriam shook her head but did not argue further. She had learned long ago that some men could not be talked out of their choices, especially when those choices involved women they would not admit to loving. Xander left with the dress under his arm and walked back through the waking town to the river. The ferry landing was quiet, the boat tied and waiting, and he stood for a moment looking across the water toward the far bank, where smoke was starting to rise from the Penhallow cottage chimney. He had been thinking about this for months, not just the dress, though the dress was part of it, all of it. The spring, the testimony, the cost of speaking up when speaking up meant losing the only work he had. He had known since winter what Leonard Whitley was doing, had known because Whitley paid him double fare to make crossings late at night when no one was watching, to carry men and tools and materials upstream where the spring ran down from the high ground. He had not asked questions. Ferryman did not ask questions, but he had watched and he had understood, and when the Penhallow spring ran dry he had known exactly why. He could have said nothing, should have said nothing. The ferry contract was granted by the town council, and Leonard Whitley sat on the town council, and a man who spoke against Whitley would find himself without a boat or a license before the week was out. But he had also watched Sera carry her grandfather through the snow, had seen the way she held herself straight even when exhaustion bent her double, had noticed the careful way she mended her clothes and tended her mother, and never once asked for anything she had not earned. And he had made his choice the same way he made every choice, quietly, completely, and without room for doubt. The dress was the first part. The testimony would be the second. And whatever came after, he would face it the same way he faced the river every morning, with steady hands and no regrets. He hid the dress in his cottage, wrapped tight and tucked into the chest where he kept his father's things, and then he went to work. The day before the assize, Sera woke before dawn and scrubbed herself raw in the cold water from the basin, braided her hair until her scalp ached, and put on her good skirt and the blouse that was only slightly faded at the elbows. She looked at herself in the small square of polished metal that served as a mirror and saw exactly what she expected, an orc girl in poor clothes trying to look respectable and failing. Her mother kissed her forehead. "Speak clearly," she said. "Do not let them make you angry. Anger will give them an excuse to dismiss you." Sera nodded. She had been coached in this by the magistrate's clerk, a nervous young man who had delivered the summons and then spent an uncomfortable hour explaining how the assize worked. Stand when you are called. Address the judge as your honor. Answer only what is asked. Do not argue. Do not raise your voice. Do not show emotion. Be small, in other words. Be quiet. Be grateful they are listening at all. She left the cottage and walked down to the ferry landing as the sun was breaking over the eastern hills. The ferry was already waiting and the ferryman was standing beside it with his hands in his pockets, watching her approach. She stopped a few feet away. "I need to cross," she said. "I know. I have fare. I know," he gestured to the boat. She got in and he pushed off without taking her coins. She did not argue. She had learned that arguing with Xander Cole was like arguing with the river, pointless and exhausting and ultimately futile. Halfway across, he spoke. "There is something you should have." She looked up. He was watching the water, his face as unreadable as always. "What? At my cottage, after I tie up?" Sera frowned. He had never invited her anywhere, had never suggested anything beyond the purely transactional exchange of fare and passage. "Why, you will see." He brought the boat in smoothly, tied it off, and held out a hand to help her onto the dock. She took it, felt the rough calluses of his palm against hers, and then he was already walking up the bank toward the small stone cottage that sat back from the water beneath a stand of oak trees. She followed, confused and growing more uneasy with every step. The cottage was neat and spare, the kind of place a man lived when he had no wife and no need for decoration. He opened the door and gestured her inside. The interior was dim and cool. A single room with a fireplace at one end, a narrow bed at the other, a table and 2 chairs in between. Everything was clean and carefully kept, and there was almost nothing in it that spoke of personality or preference, except for the chest at the foot of the bed, which he knelt beside and opened. He drew out a wrapped bundle and held it out to her. Sera took it, felt the weight of fabric inside the cotton wrapping. "What is this? Open it." She unwrapped it slowly, and the blue fabric spilled into her hands like water, like something impossibly fine and soft and utterly unlike anything she had ever owned. She stood holding it, staring, unable to process what she was seeing. "It is a dress," Xander said, as if that explained anything. "I can see that, for the assize." She looked up at him, looked back down at the dress. "Why? Because you need it." "I do not." She stopped. She did not know what to say. The dress was beautiful, more than beautiful. It was the kind of thing a woman wore when she wanted to be taken seriously, when she needed people to see her as more than a nuisance or a burden. It was the kind of thing that said she mattered. "Try it on," Xander said. He turned his back, giving her privacy in his own cottage, and stood facing the door with his arms folded. Sera hesitated, then set the dress on the table and began to undress. Her hands were shaking. She did not understand this, did not understand why he would do this or how he had known or what it meant. She pulled the dress over her head and felt it settle onto her shoulders, slide down over her body, and when she smoothed the skirts into place, she knew without looking that it fit. It fit perfectly, not just clothes, not just good enough. Perfect. As though it had been made for her body and no one else's, tailored to the exact curve of her waist and the exact breadth of her shoulders and the exact length of her arms. She stood in a strange man's cottage wearing a dress that fit her like a second skin, and something inside her broke. She started to cry. Not delicate tears, not quiet weeping. She cried the way a woman cries when something she has needed for too long finally, impossibly, arrives. Great shaking sobs that she could not control, tears that ran hot down her face and dripped onto the blue fabric, her breath coming in gasps that hurt her chest. Xander turned around. He saw her standing there in the dress, crying, and for a moment his carefully controlled expression cracked, and she saw something underneath that looked like fear. "Does it not fit?" he asked. She shook her head. "It fits." "Then why, it fits perfectly," she said, and her voice broke on the words. "How does it fit perfectly?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I measured." "How? Your apron? You brought it to me to mend. I measured you through the apron over weeks." "Every time you came to the ferry I checked." Sera stared at him. "You have been measuring me since autumn." "Yes." "Why?" "Because I knew the assize was coming. Because I knew you would need something better than what you had. Because—" He stopped, looked away. "Because I wanted to." She was still crying, but the sobs had quieted to something that felt less like breaking and more like mending. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and tried to breathe normally. "This must have cost everything you had." "It cost what it cost." "Xander, do not," he said quietly. "Do not tell me I should not have done it. It is done." Sera looked down at herself, at the beautiful blue dress that fit her as though someone had cared enough to make sure it would. "I do not know what to say." "Say you will wear it tomorrow." "Say you will walk into that courtroom and make them listen." She nodded. She could not speak. If she tried to speak, she would start crying again, and she had already cried enough to be embarrassed. Xander picked up her old skirt and blouse, folded them neatly. "Keep the dress here tonight," he said. "I will bring it to the courthouse in the morning. You should not carry it through the marsh and risk it getting dirty." "Where will I change?" "There is a room behind the courthouse. The clerk told me. He will let you use it." Sera nodded again. She wanted to say thank you. She wanted to say 1,000 things, all of them inadequate. Instead, she reached out and took his hand, held it for a moment in both of hers, and then she let go and stepped back. "I will see you tomorrow," she said. "Yes." She changed back into her old clothes, left the dress folded on his table, and walked out into the morning light feeling like she had crossed some invisible threshold and could not go back. The assize court convened in the largest building in Shepherd's Crossing, a timber-framed hall that served as a meeting house, a market hall, and a courtroom depending on the day and the need. By mid-morning, it was packed with people who had disputes to settle or simply wanted to watch the proceedings, and the air inside was close and warm despite the spring chill outside. Sera arrived early, was shown to the small room behind the hall where witnesses waited, and found Xander already there with the dress laid carefully over a chair. He nodded to her and left without a word, and she changed in the dim quiet with her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. When she emerged, the clerk looked at her with visible surprise. "You look well," he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been approval or might have been pity. She could not tell. The morning session dragged on. Property disputes, a contested inheritance, a complaint about a neighbor's fence. Sera waited and tried not to think about what she would say, how she would say it, how they would look at her when she stood up to speak. Finally, just before midday, the clerk called her name. She walked into the courtroom and every head turned to stare. She had expected that. What she had not expected was the silence. Not hostile, not mocking. Just silence, the kind that falls when something unexpected walks into a room and no one is quite sure what to make of it. The judge was an older man with gray in his beard and shrewd eyes that missed nothing. He looked at her, looked at the dress, and gestured to the witness stand. "State your name for the record." "Sera Penhallow." "You bring a complaint regarding water rights." "Yes, Your Honor." "Explain," she explained, carefully, clearly, without anger or embellishment. The spring that had fed her family's fields for years, the ditch that had been cut to divert it, the wall that had been built to keep them from reaching it, the fields that were now flooding with marsh water that killed everything they planted. The judge listened without interrupting. When she finished, he turned to the man sitting in the front row of benches, a prosperous-looking man in a fine coat with a face that had settled into permanent disdain. "Leonard Whitley. You are the landholder in question." Whitley stood. "I am, Your Honor." "What is your response to this claim?" "The spring in question rises on my land and always has. I have every right to direct its flow as I see fit. The orc camp has no legal claim to water that originates on my property." "The spring has fed our fields for 8 years, Sera said. "It is ours by use and custom." "Custom is not law," Whitley said. He did not look at her when he spoke. "And use by squatters does not grant ownership." The judge frowned. "Miss Penhallow, Do you have any documentation of your family's claim to the land you occupy? No, Your Honor. We have lived there by permission of the previous landholder, who sold to Mr. Whitley 3 years ago. Then, by what right do you claim the water? Sera felt the floor shifting beneath her, felt the careful structure of her argument crumbling. By the right of need, Your Honor. We have no other clean water. The river is brackish at our camp and the marsh is foul. Without the spring, we cannot grow food, we cannot survive. That is not the court's concern, Whitley said. If they cannot survive, they should move. Move where? Sera asked, and despite every instruction she had been given, she could hear her voice rising. Where would you have us go? We are tolerated here, barely. Everywhere else we would be driven off or worse. That is not my problem. The judge raised a hand for silence. The law is clear on this point. Water that rises on private land belongs to the landholder, unless prior claim can be documented. Miss Penhallow, do you have any evidence beyond your own testimony that the spring was in use by your family before Mr. Whitley diverted it? Sera opened her mouth to say no, to admit defeat, and then a voice spoke from the back of the room. I have evidence, Your Honor. Every head turned. Xander Cole was standing in the back row, his face as calm and unreadable as stone. The judge frowned. Who are you, Xander Cole? I operate the ferry at Shepherd's Crossing. What evidence do you have? Xander walked forward, his footsteps loud in the silent hall. He stopped at the front and turned to face the judge. I have record of the crossings I was paid to make for Mr. Whitley over the past 4 months. Late-night crossings, transporting men and materials upstream to where the spring rises. I was paid double fare to keep quiet about it, and I kept a log because I keep a log of all my work. The room erupted. Whitley surged to his feet, his face dark with fury. That is a lie. I have the log here, Xander said. He drew a small leather-bound book from his coat and held it out to the judge. Dates, times, number of passengers, cargo, and fare paid. You will see that the work began in November and continued through February, which matches the timeline Miss Penhallow described for the diversion. The judge took the book, paged through it. His expression grew colder with every line he read. Mr. Whitley, you paid for covert transport of workers to the site of the spring. I paid for ferry service, Whitley said. There is no law against that. There is a law against fraudulent alteration of water rights, the judge said. And paying a ferryman extra to work at night suggests you knew your actions would not bear scrutiny. He looked at Xander. Why come forward now? You were paid well to stay silent. I was paid to transport, Xander said. I was not paid to lie under oath, and I was not asked to ignore theft. This is absurd, Whitley said. You would take the word of a ferryman over mine. I take the word of a documented log over an undocumented claim, the judge said. He looked back at Sera. Miss Penhallow, based on the evidence presented, I find in your favor. The spring is to be returned to its original course within 10 days. Mr. Whitley, you will also pay a fine of £20 for attempting to defraud a legal proceeding. He banged his gavel once, sharp and final. Next case. Sera stood frozen as the courtroom dissolved into noise around her. People were talking, arguing, gathering their things. Whitley was shouting something at his solicitor. The clerk was calling for order, and Xander was walking toward the door. She caught him outside, grabbed his arm, and turned him to face her. Why did you do that? It was the truth. You will lose the ferry contract. Whitley sits on the town council. He will make sure you never work this river again. Xander shrugged. Then I will work another river. There is no other river within 30 miles. Then I will find other work. Xander, he looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time since she had known him his expression was not carefully neutral. You needed the water, he said quietly. I could help. So I did. The rest does not matter. It does matter. You gave up everything. The dress, the testimony, all of it. You gave up everything for me. Yes, he said. And then, because he had already lost everything and had nothing left to protect, he said, I would do it again. Sera felt the tears come back hot and fast, and she did not try to stop them. She stepped forward and put her arms around him, pressed her face against his shoulder, and held on like he was the only solid thing in a world that had turned to water. He stood very still for a moment, and then his arms came up and wrapped around her, and they stood together in the spring sunlight while the world rearranged itself around them. Xander lost the ferry contract 6 days later, exactly as he had known he would. Leonard Whitley called an emergency session of the town council, presented a list of complaints about unreliable service and unsafe equipment, and moved to terminate the Cole family license immediately. The vote was 4-2 in favor, and by the end of the week, a new ferryman had been installed, and Xander's boat had been impounded pending sale to cover imaginary debts. He took the news the way he took everything, quietly, without visible reaction. He packed his belongings into a single trunk, locked his cottage, and walked away from the only work he had ever known. He did not walk far. Sera met him at the edge of the marsh with her mother and her grandfather, and together they carried his trunk back to the Penhallow camp. You cannot stay here, Sera's mother said, even as she was clearing space in the cottage for his things. People will talk. It is not proper. Let them talk, Sera said. Your reputation is already ruined by being orc. Let them say I am also a woman living with a man. It changes nothing. Her mother looked like she wanted to argue, but her grandfather laughed, a wheezing sound that rattled in his chest. Let the girl have what she wants, daughter. She won her water and her man in the same week. That is more than most people get in a lifetime. Sera's mother sighed and gave up. Xander moved into the smaller of the 2 rooms, the one that had been used for storage, and set about making himself useful. He was good at useful. Within a week, he had repaired the cottage roof, shored up the sagging wall, and built a proper drainage ditch around the foundation to keep the spring rains from flooding the floor. Within 2 weeks, he had cleared the worst of the marsh from the Penhallow fields and helped Sera's grandfather plant the first of the season's vegetables. Within a month, it was as though he had always been there, a quiet presence that fit into the rhythms of their life so smoothly that Sera could not remember what it had been like before him. They did not speak about what they were to each other. There was no formal arrangement, no courtship ritual, no clear moment when things shifted from gratitude to something deeper. But Sera knew, and Xander knew, and the silence between them became a different kind of silence, not the absence of words, but the presence of understanding that did not need them. At night, after the work was done and the fire had burned low, they would sit together outside the cottage and watch the river. Xander would whittle some small piece of wood into shape, his knife moving with the same steady precision he brought to everything. Sera would mend or sew or simply sit with her hands folded in her lap, content to be near him. One night, nearly 2 months after the assize, he set down his knife and said, I have been thinking. About what? A new ferry? Sera looked at him. You have no boat. I could build one. With what money? I have some saved. Not much, but enough for materials, and I know how to build. My father taught me. Where would you launch it? Here, he said. On this side of the river. Upstream from Shepherd's Crossing, where the current is slower and the banks are firm. People need to cross here too. Farmers bringing goods to market, travelers heading north. It would work. Sera was quiet for a moment. It would compete with the crossing ferry. Yes, Whitley would try to stop you. He can try. She smiled despite herself. You are a stubborn man. Yes. And you think people will come to an Orc bank ferry run by a man who testified against Leonard Whitley? I think people will come to a ferry that gets them across the river safely and charges fair rates. The rest is noise." Sera reached out and took his hand, laced her fingers through his. "Then we will build it," she said. "Together." He looked at her and something in his expression shifted. "Together? You think I will let you do all the work? I know how to handle wood and rope as well as you do. Better, maybe. I do not doubt it. Then it is decided. We will build a ferry." Xander nodded slowly. Then he said, "If we build it together, it should have a name." "What name?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was lower than usual, rough with something he was not quite saying. "Sera's Grace." She went very still. "You want to name the ferry after me?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because you gave me a reason to build it. Because grace is what you showed me when you let me stay here, when you let me help. Because," he stopped, then made himself continue. "Because I love you, and I want everyone who crosses that river to know it." Sera felt the tears start again, and this time she let them fall. She leaned over and kissed him, tasted the salt of her own crying on his lips, and felt his arms come around her with a sureness that said he was never letting go. "Then we will call it Sera's Grace," she said against his mouth. "And we will make it the finest ferry on this river." They began work the next week. Xander had been setting aside money for years, small amounts scraped from his wages and hidden away for emergencies. It was not much, but it was enough to buy timber and pitch and iron for the fittings. Sera's grandfather knew a sawyer who owed him a favor, and the sawyer sold them good oak at half price. Sera's mother contributed the last of her savings, pressed into Sera's hand with a fierceness that forbade argument. "Build something that lasts," she said. "Build something that says we belong here." They built it on the bank just north of the cottage, where the ground was level and the water ran deep enough to launch a boat, but calm enough to work safely. Xander laid out the design in chalk on bare earth, measurements exact, every line checked and rechecked until he was satisfied. Then they began to cut. It was hard work. The kind that left them exhausted and aching at the end of every day, covered in sawdust and pitch and river mud. But it was good work too, the kind that built something real and solid, and Sera found herself happier than she had been in years. She learned that Xander sang while he worked, low, tuneless humming that had no melody but somehow fit the rhythm of saw and hammer. She learned that he was patient with mistakes but ruthless about quality, willing to tear apart a day's work if it was not right and start over without complaint. She learned that he had a scar on his ribs from where an oar had broken in a storm and stabbed him, and that he did not like to talk about it but would show her if she asked. He learned that she was stronger than she looked, could lift and carry as much as he could when the need arose. He learned that she swore in Orcish when she hit her thumb with a hammer, colorful phrases that made her grandfather laugh from where he sat watching them work. He learned that she had a birthmark on her shoulder blade shaped like a crescent moon, and that she was ticklish just below her ribs, and that when she smiled at him, he forgot whatever he had been about to say. They worked through the summer and into the autumn. The ferry took shape slowly, plank by plank, joint by joint. It was a good design, sturdy and broad-beamed, built to carry passengers and cargo safely across the current. Xander carved the name into the bow himself, careful letters that spelled out Sera's Grace in a script he had practiced on scraps until he got it right. On the day they launched it, half the valley turned out to watch. Not because they supported an Orc ferry or approved of Xander's choices, but because a boat launch was entertainment and people would take entertainment where they could find it. Sera wore the blue dress. Xander had asked her to, had said it felt right for the occasion, and she had agreed even though she knew it would draw attention. She stood on the bank beside him as the boat sat waiting in the shallows, and when the moment came she picked up the bottle of cider they had saved for this and swung it against the bow. The bottle shattered, the cider sprayed across the wood, and Xander pushed the boat into the water. It floated. Clean and level and perfect, it floated, and the small crowd watching let out a cheer that was half genuine and half ironic and entirely unexpected. Xander handed Sera into the boat, climbed in after her, and took up the oars. He rowed them out into the current, steady and sure, and brought them back to the bank in a wide loop that showed off the boat's handling. When they tied up again, there was already a line of people waiting. "How much for a crossing?" someone called. "2 pennies, Xander said. 4 if you are carrying cargo. That is half what the crossing charges. Then you are getting a good rate." The first passenger climbed in, a farmer with a basket of eggs, then another, a woman with a small child. Then 3 more, strangers heading north who had heard about the new ferry and wanted to try it. By the end of the day, they had made enough to cover the cost of materials for the month. By the end of the week, they had a regular trade. By the end of the month, they were earning more than Xander had ever made working the shepherd's crossing route, and the town council was quietly furious but unable to do anything about it. Leonard Whitley tried, of course. He filed complaints, claimed unfair competition, argued that the Penhallow landing was unsafe and unlicensed. But the law was on their side this time. The river was open water. Any man could run a ferry who had a boat and the skill, and Xander had both. The complaints were dismissed, and Whitley was forced to watch as his own ferry slowly lost business to the Orc Bank operation he had tried to destroy. It was not a complete victory. There were still people who would not cross at Sera's grace, who considered it beneath them to give their custom to an Orc ferry. There were still slurs painted on their dock in the night, still rocks thrown at their cottage, still moments when Sera walked into the market and felt every eye on her like a weight. But there were also people who came to them because they did good work and charged fair rates. People who did not care about the color of Sera's skin, or the fact that she and Xander were not legally married. People who saw the ferry and the landing and the neat cottage behind it and thought, these are good people doing honest work, and we should support that. Slowly, grudgingly, the balance began to shift. Winter came, and with it the hard cold that made the river dangerous and the crossings few. Xander and Sera spent the frozen months maintaining the boat, repairing the dock, and planning for spring. They also spent them growing closer in the small ways that matter, learning each other's rhythms and moods and silences. On the longest night of the year, when the wind howled outside and the fire burned low, Xander reached into his trunk and pulled out a small wooden box. He opened it and held it out to Sera, and inside was a ring. It was simple. A band of river silver, hammered smooth and polished until it shone. No stone, no engraving, just a circle of metal that had taken him months to save for and weeks to make. "I know we are already living as though we are married," he said, "but I want it to be real. I want you to be my wife properly with witnesses and vows and everything that makes it binding." Sera took the ring, felt the weight of it in her palm. "You know, people will not recognize it. An orc and a human married. There is no priest who will bless it. Then we will find someone who will, or we will say the vows ourselves and call it done. I do not care about the ceremony, I care about you." She slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, just like the dress had, because he had measured her hand the same way he had measured everything else about her, carefully, patiently, with an attention that bordered on worship. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." They were married in the spring, on the bank beside the ferry landing, with Sera's family and a handful of neighbors as witnesses. The magistrate's clerk agreed to officiate, more out of curiosity than approval, and he stumbled through the vows with visible discomfort but got them said. Sera wore the blue dress one more time, and when the brief ceremony was over and they were pronounced husband and wife, she kissed Xander in front of everyone and did not care who saw. The dress had been her armor once. Now it was something else, a symbol of the moment when her life had changed, when a quiet man had spent everything he had to show her she mattered. After the wedding, Miriam the seamstress came to her with an offer. "Let me remake it," she said. "The blue is still good, the fabric is still sound. I can take it apart and make it into something new. Wedding cloth, maybe. Something you can keep." Sera agreed. She brought the dress to Miriam's shop, watched as the seamstress carefully unpicked every seam, and then she waited while Miriam worked her magic. What came back was not a dress. It was a banner, long and narrow, dyed an even deeper blue, and embroidered along the edges with silver thread that caught the light. It was meant to fly from the ferry's mast, a declaration of what they had built and who they were. Xander hung it the next morning, and it flew above Sera's grace like a flag of defiance and hope. The years that followed were not easy. There were still people who hated them, still moments of danger and hardship. But there were also good years, profitable years. Years when the ferry thrived and the Penhallow fields grew thick with vegetables, and the cottage became a home. Sera's grandfather died peacefully in his sleep one winter, and they buried him on the high ground above the river where the spring rose clear and cold. Sera's mother grew older but no less fierce, and she lived to see her daughter become the most respected ferry operator on the river, orc or human. And Sera and Xander worked side by side, year after year, building a life that was entirely their own. On their 5th anniversary, Sera told him she was pregnant. He went very still, his hands frozen on the oar he had been mending. Then he set it down carefully, crossed the room, and pulled her into his arms so tightly she could barely breathe. "A child," he said, and his voice was shaking. "Yes, ours. Yes." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her mouth. "What do? We prepare," she said, laughing. "What else?" They prepared. Xander built a cradle from river oak, sanded and oiled until it was smooth as glass. Sera sewed blankets and tiny clothes, her stitches careful and even. Her mother clucked and fussed and filled the cottage with advice that was mostly unwanted but occasionally useful. The baby came in the early autumn, born during a rainstorm that turned the river wild and gray. Sera labored through the night with her mother and the midwife beside her, and Xander paced outside until the walls shook with his worry. When the baby finally came, squalling and red-faced and perfect, the midwife wrapped him in a blanket and brought him to Xander. "A son," she said. Xander took the baby with hands that shook, looked down at the small face, and felt something inside him settle into place. The baby had Sera's green skin and his own dark hair, tiny tusks just beginning to show, and eyes that were still cloudy but would probably turn brown like his mother's. "His name is William," Xander said, because he had been thinking about names for months, and that was the one that felt right. Strong and solid and human enough that the boy would not be dismissed out of hand, Sera smiled from the bed, exhausted and sweat-soaked and radiant. "William Cole," she said. "I like it." William grew up on the ferry, learned to swim before he could walk properly, learned the feel of oars in his hands before he learned to write his letters. He was a happy child, curious and fearless, and he loved the river the way his father did. Deeply, instinctively, as though it were part of his blood. 2 years later, Sera gave birth to a second son. They named him Quentin, and he was quieter than his brother, more thoughtful, with his father's steady temperament and his mother's sharp mind. The ferry thrived. The landing grew. They built a second dock, then a third, and hired help to manage the increased traffic. The blue banner flew above it all, a reminder of where they had started and what they had overcome. On their 10th anniversary, Xander and Sera stood together on the bank and watched their sons play in the shallows, splashing each other and laughing in the afternoon sun. "You ever regret it?" Sera asked. Not because she doubted, but because she wanted to hear him say it. Xander looked at her, at the life they had built, at the boys who carried both their blood and both their worlds. "No," he said, "not once, not ever." She leaned against him, felt his arm come around her shoulders, and knew he was telling the truth. The ferryman who had spent his last coins on a blue dress had gained a wife, a family, a life worth living. And the orc woman who had cried when she saw it fit her perfectly had gained the same. They had built something together that no one could take away, and it was enough. More than enough, it was everything.